Okay, in some of the other demos we talked about lettering and using Adobe Illustrator to do lettering, but you can also use Adobe Photoshop to do lettering as well. What's the difference between the two? Which one is a preference? Actually, there's not much of a difference other than file size and that the more layers you have in a Photoshop file, the larger it is. But nesting a Photoshop image in Adobe Illustrator also makes a large file. So I personally haven't seen much of a difference other than one is vector and one is raster. I personally think the end result is if you're going to send it to print or save for a web, Photoshop's probably one of the better ways to do it. So that being said, just a quick review, most of what the text rules that we covered in some of the other demos are still going to apply, meaning that we want to have a good dialogue font to use and we want to have centered text. What I'm going to really show you in this demo is how Photoshop treats text and how you create your shapes, and I think that's also one of the significant differences, is that the shapes that you create in Photoshop a little trickier to manipulate than in Illustrator. In Illustrator, I have points that I can manipulate the shapes and change the shapes of them a lot quicker than I think I can do in Photoshop. So here we go. In Photoshop, we have a text toolbar, and again, the capital letter T is what I'm going to use to create my text. If I click and drag, it will create a text box that I can then put whatever text that I want in there, like so. Now, what we want to do actually is we're just going to go ahead and select some text that I've already set up in here already. And that you can see if I click on this text, I have a text box already created. And when Photoshop creates a text box, it creates a layer. And it'll even display as the name of the layer what your text is. So that makes it pretty easy to find where things are. Now, just like in Illustrator, I can adjust this and the text box will reflow the text to whatever size I want it to be. Now, how do I create actual word balloons and the like in Photoshop? Well, right under the text tool, I have all my shapes. And in this particular instance, I'm not going to use my standard rectangle shapes. I mean, I could if I wanted to, but I'm actually going to go to the custom shape tool. And notice up here at the top, this gives me options that I can go back to the square tool if I want, and I could create a rectangular dialog box. And when I create a shape in Photoshop, what it actually does is it creates what it calls a shape layer. And the shape layer is based off of your color palette here. So you see how my shape is gray. It's because my foreground color here is gray. If it were set to white, then my shape would be white. And thus I have a white box instead. But when I create a custom shape, and that's going to be when you click on the star feature, it'll have right next to it what it calls the shapes that I can choose from, meaning I have some predetermined shapes, and there's a whole bunch that I can choose from, animals, whatever it is that I want. In this particular case, Photoshop, recognizing how more and more comic creators are using the software to create their images, created talk bubbles. And here we are, pre-made talk bubbles that we can use. They call them talk bubbles, but dialogue balloons, whatever. You kind of know what they're talking about here. So I could select one of these if I wanted, and if I click and drag, see how it actually creates the shape for me. Now, one of the problems with that is that presently all it is it's just a shape. I mean, I can move it to wherever I want to go, and I can change its size if I want it to change it. But one of the problems that I have is that it's not going to have, if I have to put it like over here in this white area, it's not, when I print, it's not going to have that line around it. That line is a part of a path, and you see how if I click off of it, I can still get the shape that I want. But it's not going to give me that stroke around it as well. So this is one of the issues that I found with lettering in Photoshop. You can put a stroke around it, and for that you're going to use the Path dialog box. And if you can't find it, if it's not open, you just go to Window, and you'll select Path, and then it shows up right here. So I'll select on it, and see how it's highlighted blue, and it shows up here, and that means my path is selected. And what I want to do is I want to turn it into an actual selection, meaning marching ants are going around it. And it creates this layer mask feature that this feature right here is an opaque feature. I can change its color, but it's basically a mask. I would want to put the dialog balloon on its own layer. So I'm going to create a new layer. And I'm going to fill that layer with white, because most of my dialog balloons are white. But I'm now going to also put a black stroke around it. Now we have to be careful with the stroke, because remember we use about a 2-point stroke because you don't want it too thick, but you also don't want it too thin either. And Photoshop works in pixels. So like right now it's set at 20 pixels. Oops, let's restroke that again. It's set at 20 pixels. I'm going to set the color to black so you can see the actual stroke effect to it. And I want it to go outside. If I go in the center or inside, it's actually going to come closer to the inside, and that takes away the amount of space that I have when I put my text in. So I want it to actually go to the outside of it. And see how 20 pixels is really kind of thick and kind of clunky. So what we want to do is set it to a smaller stroke effect, and 20 is usually a little too much, so we're just going to change that to 10 actually. And 10 is your nice kind of comfortable stroke effect to it. There you go. And so now I can now put it in on and move around all my text effect that I want. Now, you might notice that as I move it over, you see how it's covering up your words? Well, there's a reason for that. And the reason being is that because the text is white. So it's not actually covering over it, it's just that you can't read white text on a white background. If I were to move them behind here, behind the black text, you could see it clearly because you can read black text on the white background. So that's pretty much what the issue is. If I move it here, why we can't see it. And of course, I have lots of different shapes that I can use. I have bursts, I have thought bubbles, and of course I can create dialog boxes the same way without tails on them by just selecting the square rectangular shape, creating a new layer, drawing my box, And I don't want it to be a black box, so I'm going to get my marching ants going around it. And I'm going to fill it. And we're going to fill it with white. And then we're going to stroke it with 10 points black stroke on the outside. I'll turn my marching ants off, and now I have a text box. And again, you can't see the text because it's white text on a white background, but I can put it behind black text and you'll see it just fine. Now, say you want to change this so that it fits in here. Well, I'll go to Edit, Transform, Scale. I have to make sure that I'm on the correct layer, otherwise it's going to distort what you don't want it to distort, something you don't want to distort. Well, I've got the actual layer itself selected, so I can now change the size of that box and double click when I'm done, and now it's the size that I need it to be so it fits my text a little more comfortably. And this isn't a bad way to do it. You can also take some of the templates that you've done in Illustrator. So say we take one of our word balloons that we really like that we did here in Illustrator. I can actually select it, copy it, and then I can go to my Photoshop file and I can paste it as pixels. You can adjust its size, and now it's on its own layer. So you can actually bring in some of your templates. You can create a template page in Photoshop where they're all on their own layer, and just drag and drop them into your Photoshop file. So Photoshop, I think, is not a bad way to go as far as lettering goes. You have the same amount of control as you do in Illustrator. The only thing that I really stress about it is one of its unique advantages is that, you know, the ability to save it for web, which you can also do in Illustrator. But it becomes kind of a one-stop shop here in Photoshop. You can do all your digital effects, and then you can start to go ahead and lettering it. It's just the ability that I can't change the tail here on this graphic. What I see is what I get. I can actually distort the graphic if I want to, but unlike Illustrator, where I can come in and I can move these pieces around, I can't do that in Photoshop. So the tails are pretty much what you have, and that's what you kind of have to work with. Unless you know a little more about Photoshop, that you can go in and change the actual path, which is a little more advanced than what we want to get into with here. So that's pretty much it. If you want to use Photoshop, same rules of text are going to apply. You can create shapes using the shape tools. They're already pre-made shapes. You want to stroke it with about a 10 pixel black stroke on the outside, but you want to make sure that your text is nice and centered and type. And that's pretty much it.